listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by RealAgriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Who should decide how land gets used? That's a big question when it comes to the future of farmland and land use policy here in Canada and across North America. As we continue with Season 3 of the Ag Policy Connection podcast here on Real Agriculture, together with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI. I'm Kelvin Hepner, and on this episode, we're going to be discussing that big question. Who gets to decide? Should it be used for conservation purposes, development reasons, agriculture and food security? Which factor should be given the highest priority or the most weight? And how do we balance the interests and rights of private landowners versus the public in society when there are public goods or things society wants or sees value in coming from privately owned land? These are some of the questions that we're going to explore with our panel on this episode. So we're excited to welcome in Bronwynne Wilton. Bronwynne is a principal with Wilton Consulting Group based in Southern Ontario. She also has some experience in municipal government. Chad Lawley is an ag economics professor at the University of Manitoba. And rounding out our panel, Michael Champion, head of industry and government relations in Saskatchewan with Ducks Unlimited Canada, as we dive into the question of who should get to decide how land is used. So we're talking about the big question of who should get to decide how land is used, whether it gets used for conservation purposes, development purposes. Of course, housing is a big part of the conversation across Canada right now, or food, agriculture production. Why should we think about, and as part of that, why should we think about how land gets used? Bronwynne, why don't we start with you? I know I come at this from a Western Canadian perspective where we have ample land, it feels like, and we export food from Western Canada to other parts of the world. You come at it from maybe a more of an Ontario perspective. Can you fill us in on why you think we should think about how land gets used?
Yeah, no, definitely. And you're right. We in Southern Ontario in particular feel the pressure from the housing demands and the urban expansion demands in a very real way. And I can give you a few examples as we go through the conversation. But yeah, thinking about why we need to decide how land gets used. It's basically fundamentally a finite resource, especially when you think about the prime farmland, so the classes 1, 2, 3, even though classes 4 to 6 also have very useful agricultural functionality. But yeah, those class 1 to 3 lands, especially where we have some really favorable agroclimatic conditions as well, it's like good rainfall and the good topography and not only the geographic kind of things, but also the infrastructure around agricultural lands. So in Southern Ontario, we have some really good supply chain systems. We also export a lot of commodities globally, and we have some very high specialty crop areas, such as the tenderfruit region in Niagara and the marsh, which is a Holland marsh soils, where we have the highest level of carrots grown across the country. So we have some really important agricultural resources in Ontario, and we need to really be thinking hard about how we're using those, protecting those, and conserving them for future generations.
Mm-hmm. Michael, how about from your perspective? Why is it important we have this conversation that we're having today?
Well, and I think similar to what Bronwynne's saying, I mean, fundamentally, land is a finite resource. We need to approach this from I think at a scale where we're going to protect the resiliency of the Canadian landscape writ large. And we need to understand the various different competitive interests, whether it be for housing and expanding urban areas or for the transition that we see in Western Canada, where I've spent the bulk of my 20 plus year career working, is that change from natural areas, vegetation into annual cropland, and, linking in how marginal lands play in that area. So, having this discussion is critical. We need to have a serious discussion about land use because it is a big issue that encompasses not just agriculture, but that urban expansion as well.
Chad, how about from maybe more the academic perspective, the research side of things, in your position, what do you see in terms of why we should be thinking about this and having this conversation?
Yeah, so I guess, most of the land that we're talking about is privately owned. And so you've got individual actors sort of making decisions in their own best interest. And many of them would also be thinking about social objectives as well. But, in those cases, I think there's I guess we'd call it a coordination failure. And so there's always private landowners making independent decisions, whereas you might need someone with a broader perspective, sort of helping to decide what happens and where it happens. And so if you just think about, say, wetland preservation or conserving grasslands in the Canadian prairies, there's some gains to protecting contiguous habitat and sort of protecting large tracts. And so in those cases, I think you need another party sort of thinking about protecting, if one area is protected, that we're gonna focus efforts here to generate some contiguous protection. I guess that's just one example where I think of where a private market with a bunch of individual actors might not get us to the optimal solution.
Yeah, and I guess that gets us to the crux of the question today of who gets to decide how land is used. There's a balance between landowners and property rights in this country, and then there are public goods, though, that there are things that society wants, whether we're talking about food security or biodiversity or habitat. That value, though, is sometimes, I think what you're alluding to there, Chad, is that value isn't always recognized, and it's a matter of figuring out the balance between all those different interests here, right?
Yeah, if I could pick up on
Go
what
ahead.
Chad
Yeah.
was saying, just thinking about the farmland around, I should also correct you that I'm a municipal councillor for the township of Centre Wellington. So we're a lower tier municipality within the county of Wellington. So we have multiple levels of government here in the province of Ontario. So, but just thinking about the prime farmland that is being looked at for development and with pressures on for development within our area, it's all class 1 to 3. So it's all prime. It's beautiful farmland. And the other interesting piece about it is that our community relies entirely on groundwater for drinking water. So these farmlands in around our urban area have all been farmers have done a fantastic job over the years, participated in environmental farm plan, put in stewardship practices to protect streams and waterways, kind of set aside marginal lands in some cases for wetlands, and done some excellent work in forest, like small woodlot management. And so when we think about developing it for urban uses, we're not only losing that productive value of the farmland itself, but also all those ecosystem services that go along with that land parcel. So, and just to kind of put it in context, we've recently gone through an urban boundary expansion review, and the developers who've been buying up the farmland around our urban areas wanted an ask of total of 973 hectares to add it into the urban boundary, which is approximately 2,400 acres. And all we need to meet the province's demands on how much our community absorbs some of the growth in the province, we got it down from our initial range of 400 hectares to 326 hectares. So you have this disconnect of what's being out there. And as Chad was saying, you have those individual actors, such as the farmers, being offered extremely lucrative prices. So it's difficult for them to kind of say no, and I don't blame them at all for that. And within that context of what's happening on the landscape. So just some other pieces there.
That's good info and a good specific example. Do you hear pushback from landowners in terms of not wanting to be restricted in their options, what they can do with their land?
Yeah, I think it goes without saying that's their land and that's their choice and who they sell it to. There's no other mechanism within the province of Ontario to protect it otherwise. So, I mean, there are some efforts in terms of some organizations like the Ontario Farmland Trust who would be happy to put an easement on the land to keep it within farming, but that comes at a cost to the landowner. So, yeah, so I don't think anyone blames the individual farmer, Whereas the Ontario Federation of Agriculture and all the local federations of agriculture, collectively, they do advocate for farmland protection, but they're looking for more provincial broad policies to set that framework where prime land should be protected as a social and public good.
Mm-hmm. Michael, how about from your perspective, what do you see as some examples where policies have been effective or where there are successful approaches to preserving farmland, as Bronwynne's talking about, as well as promoting the conservation and biodiversity values?
Well, and I think this is an area where I don't know that any government's got it particularly right, but I don't know that any government's really failed either. I think it's one of those gray areas where you can get ENGO companies like Ducks Unlimited Canada that can come in and help support government in their growth initiatives, help support the agricultural sector through program delivery of beneficial management practices, engaging with Indigenous communities in some instances, and ensuring that that the areas that are best suited for farming, for primary agriculture, remain in primary agriculture. And then having that kind of that bigger viewpoint, we've engaged here in Saskatchewan with the city of Saskatoon on a very successful wetland offset policy for their expansion as the city of Saskatoon grows, which pales in comparison to the expansion in central Canada and in British Columbia. But it is an example here locally where we've been able to engage with the municipal government on how it's going to grow. And we've started to engage with municipalities in Saskatchewan as well on, let's have a serious conversation about what we want to do. How do we want to develop farms, and how does conservation lands play in there? And we're very good at leveraging dollars in to support growth, and while protecting the ag sector. The lands that Ducks Unlimited engages with, by and large, still remain as agricultural land. It might not be an annual crops, but there will be typically cows. So we'll have livestock grazing, sometimes horse grazing, but typically livestock sector engages with us on program delivery, and that helps the ag sector generally. So I think what Bronwynne and Chad are referring to it, on this policy discussion, this is where conservation community can come in and help with some of the supports as needed.
To me, it brings up the question of the old carrot versus stick discussion. Do we want carrots where there's incentives for landowners to act in certain ways or put land into certain uses, or do we need a stick in some cases where it comes from above in terms of rules around how farmland gets used and obviously enforcement if it doesn't get used according to the directions from government or policymakers? What would you say you're seeing in terms of the having a successful approach, Michael, in terms of Ducks Unlimited's work?
So we're heavy on the carrot side, and we're not a regulator, so we have no stick. But I think on the carrot side, I just did some very quick math here last week with the Prairie region, so the 3 Prairie provinces. We've invested about $30 million last year alone, or this past season, into ag programming. So that's a significant, push into the ag sector for support. Our programs almost always sell out, so there is. I think the proof is in the pudding there that our programs sell out regularly. There is a demand for the carrot, and especially as we see, the land prices increase, and Saskatchewan's still one of the best buys, in Canada, if not on the planet. So, even in a fairly, cheap market to buy into, and I say that with all the qualifications that are required, there is still a demand because the producer margins are so tight. So, we have these programs that have been successful. What we aren't seeing is really any kind of need from our side of things anyway for a kind of a stick approach. We really like that carrot approach. Let's reward the good behavior, and then I think eventually bad behavior gets weeded out. Just as markets shift and take form. So, I think that's where Ducks sits anyway.
Yeah, if I might add that I think it's be a little bit different in the Ontario context. And again, I'll say the Southern Ontario context because Northern Ontario is quite different. Um, but yeah, it's not so much a carrot or stick for the individual landowners, but I think what would be preferred is if there could be a recognition that prime farmland is this finite and unique and special resource. So in Ontario, we also have quite a bit of aggregate resource that is protected quite strongly in provincial policy. So you don't want to build urban development over top of aggregate resources, locking it away for future. And I think the same kind of and water is quite well protected, although some would argue there's some weak spots in the water protection policies in the province. But but yeah, the farmland kind of gets put in as, yeah, we'll protect it until we need it for something more important. So I think if we can change that conversation amongst policymakers, and it has to be across the board, because again, you can't pit farmer against farmer or county against county. You want to have it that the resource is the resource, and you want to protect that. And along with that comes that farm infrastructure and the talents and skills of our farm sector, of course. So that's where I find we're getting into problems here because we have another example just to the west of where we are. I'm sure some of you have heard about it in Wilmot Township, where there's the province and the region are actively working to expropriate farmland that is prime farmland, very actively generational farms that, one of them's like a pretty unique award-winning cheese production facility, dairy farm. So there you see that again, the recognition, okay, it's prime farmland, but now we need it for industrial uses. So it's no longer needed for that. So that's where I'd like the conversation to happen in not only in Ontario, but across the country in terms of our national need to protect our prime agricultural resources.
Yeah. So Chad, how do we measure or convey? Bronwyn and Michael have talked about some of the different ways of valuing land. To me, it's easy for a municipal government or a chamber of commerce to see the development value of land or the industrial potential for land. And from a farming perspective, we know the productivity yields potential of land. But if we look at it from a resource perspective, like Bronwyn's talking about, or from an ecological value, how do we measure and then convey that in decisions around how land gets used?
Yeah, that's tough, right? So a lot of the sort of say benefits, ecological benefits, those are just not traded in markets, and so it's challenging to come up with prices or values. Difficult if not sort of impossible. Although there are attempts. I guess so. So those benefits, say, of ecological preservation are hard to quantify. Something maybe that's not also quantified or looked at closely is just if you develop residential or commercial, so there's sort of benefits to that, but there's also increased costs that occur. So now you're servicing residential and commercial properties, and so municipal costs will go up. Others would know more about that than I do, but yeah, I guess. And can I go back just a little bit on carrots and sticks?
Sure. Yeah.
Just briefly. Yeah. So I guess say with grassland and wetland conservation, say in the Canadian prairies. So on the one hand, you can preserve what's still there. And so it might be under threat of conversion, and so you take efforts to take steps to preserve it. You can also restore additional wetland and grassland. I guess I see one of the fundamental problems with an approach to preserve is that it's really challenging for conservation agencies, to know what is actually at risk and what is not. And so you can end up spending a lot of money on stuff that's not at significant risk of conversion, and then still lose properties. And so I think in those cases, like, there's an argument for more of a stick from government, where we just say, we need to stem the loss of these properties, and you're just not not allowed to convert those, or maybe there's a no net loss type of policy. Carrots, I think, you don't have to worry about assessing risk and that sort of thing if you're generating new activity, because you can observe that it's new activity. Sorry, I'll leave it there. I just wanted to get that in.
No, that makes sense. To me, I remember years ago learning about ALICE, the Alternative Land Use Services Program, this ecological goods and services. And at the time, I was fresh out of university and coming out of, I don't think I was in your class, Chad, but coming out of an economics class, it made a whole lot of sense. Like, let's put some value on these things that society wants. And to me, there has been maybe some successful examples of ecological goods and services type programs, but certainly not at a large scale. And I guess the issue there is who's going to pay for them is a big part of it. There's a public good, and so there probably should be a public funding of that, Chad, or what's your perspective on potentially having value assigned to ecological goods and services, such as an ALICE program? I know that's just one example. Ducks Unlimited might have their own types of programs as well.
Yeah, so you got the benefits, and then you sort of have to decide, are we willing to, those benefits exceed the cost, even if we can't measure the benefits really precisely. But yeah, so these are public goods, and public goods are famously underprovided, right? Because individuals don't have an incentive to chip into the full extent. And so, yeah, I think you need, so Ducks Unlimited is raising money from government sources and from private donations. Nature Conservancy Canada is doing the same thing. So there's this mix of federal and private money going in. I think it's probably not enough. More public dollars should be devoted to this, and I think it's if the benefits aren't fully recognized, we're probably not going to be putting in sufficient money. That's tough, of course.
Yeah, Michael, where do you see this type of program headed in terms of?
Well, and I was just going to pick up on some of the things that Chad has mentioned here. I think technology is going to help us. Technology has always helped us. I think it's going to really help us on conservation moving forward. As companies like Ducks, we're developing a biodiversity tool to help for on-farm payments for the biodiversity that they provide. Carbon markets are coming online regularly now, from what I understand. So there's another payment for the services that they're providing. But even going to an individual farm and getting their yield data map in a is it a SWOT map? I think is the right language there. And finding the very unproductive areas of that farm, and let's just start there, and let's quit losing money on the farm, and that will inherently increase resiliency. And then if we can tack a carbon and a biodiversity payment on top of that, it'll help reinforce the positive works that the farms are doing. We are seeing that here. I know of a couple of producer friends of mine that have retired certain parts of their farm because they were losing money on it. So the first step is let's quit losing money, and then you're moving in a positive direction. So I think this is the discussion to be having: is how do we leverage technology in with the government and the private funding, but starting right at the farm with, let's have you quit losing money in certain areas, and recognizing that in the middle of a field, we're probably going to continue to lose money on certain portions of farms for efficiency's sake. But this is where we talk about marginal land and having the marginal land discussion on, in corners where we can still have a square field. Let's tidy up that. Let's maybe not bring that bush into production. Not every wetland has productive farmland underneath it. Wetland drainage, I think, is a very excellent example of why we need to have land use change discussions and policies, robust policies. And this is where I said earlier, I don't know that any government's got it really right. I don't know that any government has completely failed on conversion policy. But let's look at the downstream impacts. Why is Lake Winnipeg got algal blooms, almost year round now? And and in the Qu'Appelle system here locally, we've got degraded water quality, which impacts everyone that visits Saskatchewan. So I think having those discussions is important as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just jump in there, I think that's where things might be quite different between the Prairie region
I
and
was just going to
Southern
ask,
Ontario.
you see it the same way, Bronwyn?
Yeah. I think historically, like the Environmental Farm Plan was a very popular program in Ontario for the past 25, 28 years. And farmers, there's been a lot of work. We also have conservation authorities in Ontario, which not all provinces have. So we have watershed-based mapping and planning and water management. And so the collaboration between farm organizations, conservation authorities, and municipalities has been quite strong over the past 25 years or so. And a lot of woodlots have been protected, a lot of waterways have been protected, a lot of programs aimed at rural water quality programs and the stream rehabilitations and fencing cattle and livestock out of waterways. So all that's been extremely positive, and I think farmers have pretty much leaned into that for the most part. And even now, since you mentioned Alice, there's quite a few examples of Alice across Ontario, and one recently ongoing right now in Peel region, which is a very right in the GTA, like at the edge of GTA. So not a lot of they still have farmland left in one of their municipalities, but a lot of urban development pressure with the farm community there has embraced an Alice pilot project, which is doing a lot of the same work, which is great. And in Wellington County, my upper tier municipality, they've got an experimental acres program where they're basically giving farmers small amounts of money to trial very small plot research trials of regenerative practices on their farms, just to take out some of the risks. So let farmers try some new practices to get even more of that kind of cover crop or carbon sequestration type BMPs going, things like that. So lots of positive things there. But as I mentioned earlier, you can have all those fantastic things happening, and then the urban development pressure comes along to that community, and you can lose 300 hectares within like the swipe of a pen kind of thing. So then along with that, all the good work that's been going on from a conservation and biodiversity perspective over the years as well. So not that those are all going to be totally wiped out with good urban development plans, but the risk is there for sure.
Yeah. The immense pressure from urban development in Southern Ontario, I from the way, at least my perception is that some of these smaller carrot programs that may be successful in preserving some wetland acres in Saskatchewan, that type of program probably doesn't keep land from being converted into development in Ontario.
Yeah, we do have an interesting idea being floated around, and it's drawing on some learnings from Ducks Unlimited, actually, of like a buy, sell, swap type of land investment where maybe municipalities could get into the business of protecting some key land resources around the edges. That would be brand new territory for municipalities in Ontario. So there are some examples of municipalities buying at-risk forest lands and incorporating them into climate change strategies and things like that. So it's not totally unknown. But recognizing that need to protect the groundwater recharging areas as well. And a lot of municipalities do rely on groundwater for drinking water. So understanding that interaction between protecting farmland that's well managed, along with those groundwater and source water protection zones, is an interesting conversation and really critical one.
Yeah. Chad, Bronwyn just talked about swaps, land, that type of arrangement. Do you have any examples of innovative approaches that you see as potentially making or helping us make progress in some of these areas in terms of assigning a value and conveying the value of ecological and conservation and even food production benefits or value of land?
Yeah. So first, that Ducks Unlimited, is it called a revolving land purchase program? Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really very interesting program from my perspective. Like I think it gets around some of the I guess we call them additionality concerns, where you're not sure if you're protecting habitat that's at risk or not. That type of policy, I think, creatively gets around that and sort of protects the agency. Now I know it's a very expensive, capital intensive type of program, but very innovative and interesting. Yeah, so I guess like a lot of my work has been on my research in this area has been on conservation easements, and so which would be directly linked to sort of the DUC revolving land purchase program in a way. So those have tended to be permanent easements. I think there might be room to maybe think about shorter term easements, and so sort of doing protection where maybe not as short as 10 years, but 10, 30 years. I think there's a lot of hesitancy on the part of landowners to make put a permanent easement on property. There might be more willingness to look at something like a term easement. And so if we're worried about grassland or wetland that's sort of under threat in the next 10 years, maybe a shorter term easement is easier for a landowner's stomach and gets that protection, sort of gets you through that period. And then maybe things change, right? Maybe in 30 years, you don't want an easement on that property anymore. Or maybe the economics has substantially changed. And so I think if we look at the United States, their conservation reserve program is a shorter term type of easement policy where, they're asking farmers to change from annual cropland to pasture, and they're signing 10 or 15-year contracts. Now, that's an incredibly expensive policy, and I don't see that happening here, but sort of that more temporary type of conservation might be something that we want to consider.
Michael, I'll let you speak to this program that Bronwynne and Chad are referring to, and what you see in this area in terms of how things could be tweaked or refined to make programs more effective in the future.
Well, and I certainly agree with Chad. I think the Conservation Reserve Program in the States is a tremendously expensive program, but it is certainly one that we could learn a whole bunch from on proper engagement with landowners and getting the right feedback and then protecting areas. The revolving lands program specifically, I think if you talk to our clients, they will say that it is a very important tool in their farm. And so I talked earlier about tight margins, in agriculture. I think the beef sector is maybe even the tightest of the margins. And as land prices increase, we've got livestock producers that are reliant on programs like the revolving lands so they can expand their base of operations and get that intergenerational transfer of their operation. And same with our easement program. However, Ducks Unlimited Canada also offers several 10 to 30 year programs as well. And our preference would be to call them term agreements instead of easements to keep the word easement separated. But yeah, term agreements in any term length is important. So whether it's Alice and it runs year over year, or you get into some of the ones that Ducks and NCC and others might provide, which would go anywhere from 10 to 33 years up to perpetual. I think having the whole smorgasbord of options and then letting producers pick what's going to be the best fit for them. But again, that revolving land specifically has been very important for several producers in the prairies to help them grow.
Okay. So I guess, Bronwynne, do you see these types of approaches, again, being effective? Of course, conservation and the biodiversity benefits of land is part of the discussion in Ontario too, but I maybe struggle to see how these value-added ways of adding value to land still probably pale in comparison to the pressure from development.
Yeah, and certainly you see a lot of uptake from farmers of different conservation programs that are available in Ontario. There's well-subscribed programs from biodiversity to the off-cap programs, and things like that. So there's lots of things that are happening that are really positive and good from the conservation and agriculture working together. We have Lake Simcoe in Ontario that's had some issues with runoff from agricultural areas. So there's been a lot of attention paid there in terms of getting more programs for farmers to adopt best management practices. And that's a lot in the Holland Marsh areas where they're working with muck soils, and quite a unique challenge there to figure out how to do cover cropping with muck soils and things like that. So there's all sorts of different pockets in Ontario of different landscapes and watersheds that have different challenges and different, and Lake Erie, of course, with the phosphorus algae blooms as well. So there's a lot of those programs, but then, yeah, we have, just to put it in context, I guess Ontario has currently working under a mandate to build 1.5 million more homes by 2031, which is quite ambitious. The current government's not on track to meet that target. Just a number of things that come into all how houses get built. But with that, and so the Ontario Federation of Agriculture and the Ontario Farmland Trust estimated that we lose approximately 319 acres a day of farmland in the province. And so when you have so the big cities in the Greater Toronto area are trying to fill in with going taller, so lots of big towers going up across the province. But then there's that pressure to go into greenfield development around all the small towns in southern Ontario, which are all surrounded by prime farmland. So you can see the kind of conflict we have there of how do we fit all this growth and all this housing right on the place where the best farmland in the country is. No offense to the listeners in the other parts of the country, but it is pretty rich farmland that we see in especially those specialty crop areas and class 1 farmland. So there's a big conflict there of how do you protect that. So the programs around, and it's profitable farming. So they're, corn, soybeans, wheat is doing well. The beef and dairy sectors, we have a thriving poultry sector in Ontario, and the fruit and vegetable is, very strong in Ontario, both under glass and field. So we have a lot of really strong strengths there. So yeah, these other programs, they're not going to protect the farmland against that expansive pressure from urban development on their own.
Chad, can you maybe speak to the economics of that? And I know Southern Ontario is where we talk about this issue because it is happening at the largest scale. But if you look at the fringes of the city of Calgary or the city of Winnipeg, the same issues apply there when it comes to urban, the economics of land's value for development and housing as our population continues to grow rapidly, the value there versus the value from production agriculture and even recognizing some of these programs that have incentives or assign value to ecological benefits.
Yeah, like it's tough economics. Like there's, I guess in a market economy, we sort of want to see land go to its highest value use. And again, just going back to individual decision makers, that highest value use is tending to be into residential or commercial construction. I think, so there are things that you can do in the rural economy to sort of try to preserve some of that farmland. I think maybe there's more opportunity within cities themselves. And so Bronwynne mentioned growing taller. So, incentives to sort of make the cities a little bit denser, that can help. I don't know a lot about this, but my understanding is that development fees to build new homes in Ontario, and I think Toronto in particular, have increased like way faster than the rate of inflation over the last 20 years. And so that is certainly a disincentive for developers to build new homes in those areas. I'm a little bit out of my element here. I don't follow Toronto real estate very closely, but it's sort of an urban problem, and how do you stop sprawling, right? And so, and residential zoning can play into that as well, like single family housing. And so you might need policies to relax that and to allow cities to become more dense. Now that said, I think there's always going to be pressure that people want to move out of cities and away from density in some cases, and so there is always going to be that type of pressure, and it's hard to know how to prevent that.
Yeah,
I can give one small.
Yeah, go ahead, Bronwynne.
Yeah, I can give one small example of the economics of it all. So there's an 11-acre parcel in my community that successfully rezoned for housing for townhouse development for 271 housing units, I believe, all total. It's now currently for sale with that zoning approved on it, but no housing. It's still actively farmed. It's a farm, and it's 11 acres. It's now for sale for $15.9 million. So,
Yeah, so the value immediately is recognized there in terms
yeah.
of the potential. And to me, there's a political aspect to this too, in terms of deciding how land gets used. Cities, of course, there's a lot more voters that live in cities, and they want affordable housing. And so politicians put a priority on that, or seem to be increasingly putting a priority on that. And then potentially other values aren't recognized when it comes to land. And Michael, I know in some cases, well, in many cases, landowners, either property owners in the city or property owners in rural areas, don't like to be told you can't do this with your land anymore, or you don't have this, we're taking away this option. How important is it to find the example that you shared before of, say, acres that are actually costing a producer money, and it's actually a win it's a win for multiple parties involved to find opportunities like that, rather than taking away perceived freedoms that property owners maybe feel like they have or had in the past?
Well, and that gets back to the carrot and the stick approach, and then rewarding positive business decisions. So I think it's paramount to have those examples, and even in an urban setting. I'm here in Regina. Watching my neighbors over fertilize in the summer, and then over water all summer we're wasting money in the city. I won't say we're wasting water, because it does end up back in the water cycle, but I mean, there's a cost for treatment, and we're surcharging more water than we need. So also just how we manage things. It's not just agriculture, or exclusively the cities could learn a lot more too. But coming back to making it about you and your financial situation, I've had lots of conversations with neighbors here about you're complaining that your water bill is over $100 a month. Well, you're watering your lawn for 40 minutes a day. Like, let's actually look at what we're doing, and the same could be said for farmers. If we know we're losing money in certain areas of our farm, let's look at how we can optimize that land use. And if you take it out of cropland but put it into grassland, and maybe you got a neighbor that needs hay, so you're still going to make some annual income off it, or you do some tradesies for whatever. You can there's innovation to be had out there, and I think we just need to focus on communication. Probably is the way to sum that up the best. Let's be better communicators, more open to others' needs and desires, or not desires, but needs and wants, and go from there. So
there's also a data or measuring aspect to that too, where you need to have the data to make those decisions.
Yeah, and that comes back to technology. I'm out of my element here. It's been a long while since I've been on any kind of combine. I've got friends that work though with large tractor companies, and my understanding is the technology's there. We can get real-time yield mapping. We see it with variable rate fertilizer on the input side of things. So we're innovating on ways to not spend as much, on fertilizer, which fits in with the 4R tenement anyway. So like that is very smart business. Let's look at the back end now, what we're taking off the field. And if 7 years out of 10 you're losing money, well, maybe we shouldn't be farming that land, or not farming it the way that we currently are. Let's explore other options. So yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I would say the farmers in Ontario are really embracing that profit mapping kind of exercise for sure, and I think that's a really positive thing. But yeah, I was just going to add that there is another element to this that we haven't talked about, is that food security piece. So as we see other regions
how do you measure that?
Yeah, how do you measure that is a very good question, but it is something to be aware of in terms of if we think ahead to future generations, and if we don't value this agricultural land resources as the special resource that it is. What happens down the road if like California is already seeing lots of droughts and problems with water availability for their crops, and we import a lot of fruit and vegetables and nuts and that type of thing from California. So how can we make sure we're not kind of letting our resource go, thinking that there's this abundance out there across the world that we can just continue to import and export back and forth from as we need to, but how do we start to kind of think about what's the Canadian resource and then province by province as well in terms of what we can protect for future generations. So I think that's something we really need to be aware of and be a little more cognizant of. And I would hope we can, I know it's land use is challenging because it's a provincial jurisdiction, but then agriculture is kind of a shared responsibility across federal and provincial and territorial governments. So get into some of those conversations as well. But I think it's something we have to be aware of and thinking about.
Mm-hmm. To me, it seems socially, politically, there's more of a discussion about food security, and along with a lot of other things when it comes to national security, and you look at the political situation south of us. There's a lot more focus on having things made in the country and that type of thing. Chad, how do we, in the long term, assign a value or measure the value of food security for Canada? To me, it's probably also something that also feels a lot more real in southern Ontario, where Bronwynne is, than it does, say, on the vastness of the Canadian prairies, where we don't grow a lot of the actual foods that we buy in the grocery store, but we sure export a lot of food to the rest of the world. We have excess food production capacity here. How do we measure food security and the value to our society from a theoretical perspective?
I don't know. That's tough. I think
is our favorite answer around here.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think, we're always going to be trading for these commodities, right? And so we'll be exporting some stuff, we'll be importing others. There is some value to maintaining local production, and converting farmland tends to be irreversible as well. And so once you've lost it, it's gone. And so there's some, it's scary in a sense. And if the world changes in dramatic ways that make trade difficult, then we can find ourselves in trouble. So I don't know how to really value that or think through that in a really concrete way. I guess it's hopefully trade relations remain good, and we're able to export and import. And I think in an era of climate change, there are advantages to being able to source products from around the world. And so if one region is having a drought, you can maybe import from another, or you're exporting to regions that are experiencing difficulties. So I think maintaining sort of those global trade relations and having a diversity of food sources is to our advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting we'd
no
adopt. But yeah, it's probably feel it a little more acutely here in Ontario, as Kelvin said.
Yeah, to me, just the direction things are headed right now in terms of opposition to trade and not recognizing comparative advantage in terms of different parts of the world being able to produce things, and just these increasingly thick borders, food security certainly becomes more of a priority in situations like that.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah.
And I think maintaining that capacity to produce your own food and to shift commodity production is according to what might be the need of the day. But if you lose the land base itself, then you're kind of diminishing that capacity for future needs and pressures and things. So yeah, that'd be a point I'd want to keep in mind.
I agree.
Okay. Final round of questions here. Question that I'm going to ask each of you, and it is when we look at how land use decisions are made today, who should have more weight than they have today in terms of, or who do you feel isn't heard strong enough in terms of the conversations and policy decisions that are made regarding land today? And I might be putting you on the spot here a little bit, but Bronwynne, I'll start with you. Who do you think should have more say in how land gets used than currently happens?
It's a pretty easy one for me. I'd say rural communities across at least province of Ontario. We find a lot of decisions are very Toronto centric, so it gets to be very challenging to know not only the biophysical resources of your community, but also that social and cultural heritage and resources that are important as well. So when you come to land use decision making at the local level, you can be as strong and clear as you would like to be about protecting farmland and conserving kind of these resources for future use, future generations. But the provincial policy doesn't always take all that local knowledge into account. So I think, and with that, I would include the farm sector, the agricultural sector. They tend to get kind of put in as one voice at a table, whereas really it should be a much stronger and more robust relationship and collaboration between the farm sector and the agricultural sector and land use planning and decision making.
Michael, and I don't mean to ask you a dangerous question here, but which stakeholders or factors do you think should be given a higher priority or weight in land use policy?
I agree with rural population in the prairies needs to be heard. We might be doing it a little better here. There are several farm groups, whether it's SARM here in Saskatchewan or APAS, Conservation Development Authorities, CAP in Manitoba. I'm not as familiar with Alberta, but there are an abundance of farm groups that seem to be consulted well. So I think, that being said, I think the government should keep the foot on the pedal there. And then maybe one criticism for the kind of prairie governments is I don't know that Indigenous populations feel that they are adequately consulted, especially as we talk about social, cultural, historic, for those communities. So that might be an area where, the governments could probably do a little better job here out west.
That would be the same in Ontario as well. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that is a big part of the discussion here too, and certainly part of a lot of these discussions or decisions that will be made in the future is sharing that Indigenous perspective and making sure that they're at the table as well. Lastly, to you, Chad, in terms of the current land use policy environment, where you see there being maybe a shortfall in terms of perspective from certain stakeholders.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a shortfall, but I guess I would say that there's, so if you think of drainage, so that's sometimes one landowner's draining and influencing, another landowner downstream who might also be farming land. And so I think some of those interactions are not always taken into account like they could be. And so I think there are, and even if we think about intensive livestock production and sort of impacts, that's the land use choice, I suppose. But that can also have, impacts beyond the farm in those rural communities. And then I would also bring up Indigenous perspectives. Those are probably not heard like they should be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a topic that, we could continue this discussion for a long time. There's lots of specific examples and issues that need working through. And some of this, our discussion is more from a theoretical high level perspective, but thank you for sharing some specific examples here as well. And I certainly think our audience is going to be engaged in thinking about this. We're all stakeholders in this. We're either landowners or people who live around these developments and these policy decisions, and certainly benefit from some of the public goods that come from these lands as well. So to me, this is a conversation that all Canadians, everybody should be involved in. And so thank you for participating, taking time from your day today, Bronwynne, Michael, and Chad. Thank you for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
We talked about it earlier in this season of the Ag Policy Connection podcast about how these conversations about land, especially when it's land that we have a personal connection to, there's not only an economic aspect to it, there's also usually some politics and almost always an emotional part to it as well. And so if you have feelings, thoughts about something that we talked about today, my email address, khepner@realagriculture.com. Thanks again to Bronwynne Wilton, Chad Lawley, and Michael Champion for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection as we discussed who gets to decide how land is used and how those decisions should be made, what's driving decisions and policy around land use across Canada today, and maybe what it should look like in the future. That point at the end about Indigenous voices being heard, that's something that I'll admit we should have talked about earlier in the episode. So again, if you have thoughts, my email address, khepner@realagriculture.com. Looking forward to our sixth and final episode. Hard to believe we have already done 5 in the series here. And our sixth and final episode of this season of the Ag Policy Connection podcast, exploring the future of farmland and land use policy, featuring the next generation doctoral candidates from, or fellowship recipients from across Canada, working together with CAPI on research related to land use policy and how some of these things that we talked about can be moved forward. We're going to hear from several doctoral candidates from across Canada, working at universities across the country as part of episode 6. We're calling it The Next Generation. So stay tuned for more here on the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. I'm Kelvin Hepner. Until next time, take care.